Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling a subject that is genuinely massive. I mean, we are talking about a figure who isn't just a part of history. He quite literally defines the present for an entire nation.
That's absolutely right.
You really can't walk down a street, open a wallet, or walk into a government office in Turkey without seeing his face.
Not an exaggeration in the slightest. We are looking at Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And to say he's the founder of the Republic of Turkey is true, but it almost feels like an understatement. He's the architect of modern Turkey's entire psyche.
Exactly, the architect. I was reading through the source material, and it just struck me. This guy is on every single banknote. His portrait is in every classroom, every government office. There are statues of him in every town square. It feels less like historical reverence and more like a ubiquitous living presence.
Almost like a form of secular sainthood.
Yes, that's the perfect phrase for it.
And that's really what makes this deep dive so fascinating. Our mission today is to understand how one man took a crumbling, centuries-old Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire, and in the span of roughly 15 years, dragged it, sometimes kicking and screaming, into becoming a secular, modern nation-state.
And it's not just a simple hero story, right? Because the sources we have, I mean, they paint a very, very complex picture.
Oh, incredibly complex.
We've got a comprehensive biographical and historical overview here covering his military career, his reforms, but also the controversies. Because, and this is the tension we really need to explore, he championed Western democracy. He was always talking about the sovereignty of the people.
Right.
But to get there, he ruled as a single-party leader who brutally suppressed opposition.
Precisely. It's the central paradox of authoritarian enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you force a country to be free? Can you impose democracy from the top down? Ataturk is the ultimate test case for those questions.
He believed he had to temporarily suspend freedom to build the institutions for future freedom.
Yep.
It's a huge contradiction.
A massive one. And his entire legacy is caught in the balance of that contradiction.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start at the beginning. Origin story time. He wasn't born Ataturk, was he? That name came much, much later.
Not at all. He was born simply Mustafa in 1881, and he was born in Salonika. Now, you have to understand, Salonika was part of the Ottoman Empire back then, but today it's Thessaloniki in Greece.
Right. So that location is important.
It's absolutely key to understanding him. Salonika wasn't some dusty backwater. It was a bustling, cosmopolitan, multicultural port city. It was the empire's main window to the west.
So it was a melting pot.
A total melting pot. You had a huge Jewish population, Greeks, Albanians, Slavs, Turks, merchants from all over Europe. Revolutionary ideas were bubbling up in the coffee houses. So young Mustafa grew up seeing the stark contrast between the dynamism of the West and the slow, creeping decay of the Ottoman state.
And I was reading that there's even some debate about his family background.
There is, yeah. It's a topic of endless debate. Some theories suggest he had Albanian or Slavic roots. The more generally accepted view is that his family were Turkish-speaking Muslims who had migrated from Anatolia. But culturally, he was a product of that cosmopolitan Ottoman Balkan environment. He wasn't looking toward Mecca, he was looking toward Paris and Berlin.
And what about the name Kemal? Where did that come from? I found this detail kind of charming in the source material.
It is a nice bit of lore, isn't it? He was a gifted student, especially in math, and his mathematics teacher gave him the second name, Kemal.
Which means?
It means perfection or maturity. The common story is that the teacher did it to distinguish him from another student who was also named Mustafa. But some sources suggest it was just because the teacher was so blown away by young Mustafa's capability. He was a standout from the very start.
So we have Mustafa Kemal, the perfect student. He decides to go into the military, which I gather was the standard path for ambitious young men in the empire at that time who didn't come from money.
It was really the only path for someone of his relatively modest background to rise. The Ottoman Empire was a lot of things, but the military was one of the few places that was, a genuine meritocracy, and rise he did.
His early career was pretty active. He was involved in suppressing revolts. He was part of the Young Turk movement. But the first real gritty combat experience came in Libya, right? During the Italy-Turkish War.
Yes, in 1911. And this is where he gets a significant injury. He was fighting the Italians near the city of Derna. There was an air raid, one of the first in history, actually, and a piece of limestone rubble from a bombed building struck his left eye.
Ouch. And the injury was permanent.
It was. He suffered permanent tissue damage. He actually tried to leave the medical facility early to get back to the front. It just shows you his tenacity, his drive. Even in later photographs, if you look very closely, you can see that his left eye has a slightly different, more strained look.
But the real turning point, the moment he goes from being just another capable officer to a genuine national hero, is World War I.
Gallipoli.
Gallipoli.
Gallipoli is the crucible where the legend is forged. It's 1915. The Allied powers, Britain, France, the ANZs from Australia and New Zealand, they're trying to force their way through the Dardanelles Strait to capture the capital, Istanbul.
And if they succeed, the Ottoman Empire is knocked out of the war immediately.
Instantly. The whole thing's over. Mustafa Kemal was a commander there, a lieutenant colonel, and he correctly anticipated where the Allies were going to land at Suvla Bay. His superiors disagreed, but he was right.
He saw it coming when others didn't.
He did. He rushed his division to the high ground and held it against overwhelming odds. He famously told his men a line that has gone down in history: "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die."
That is such a chilling, powerful line.
It is, but it speaks to the absolute desperation of the moment. He knew that if they gave an inch, if they retreated, the capital would fall and the empire would be finished, and they held. They held on.
And that victory, it basically made him a household name.
It made him the savior of Istanbul. While the rest of the Ottoman war effort was, frankly, a disaster on most fronts, Gallipoli was this shining, incredible victory against the might of the British Empire. It gave him a level of credibility and fame that no other general or politician had.
Which is deeply ironic, because the empire collapses anyway, doesn't it?
It does. Despite his efforts, the Ottoman Empire was on the losing side of World War I, along with Germany and Austria-Hungary. By 1918, it's all over. The empire is defeated, and the Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, Greece, they start carving it up like a Thanksgiving turkey.
They don't just take the Arab provinces. They start carving up Anatolia, the Turkish heartland itself.
Exactly. They occupy Istanbul, the Greeks land in Izmir, the French move into the south. It looks like Turkey is about to be erased from the map.
And this is what the sources call his George Washington moment, because most generals would have just accepted the defeat, maybe retired quietly. But Mustafa Kemal goes rogue.
He absolutely goes rogue. The Sultan's government in Istanbul is basically a puppet of the British High Commissioner at this point. They're signing humiliating treaties, like the Treaty of Sèvres, which basically gives away huge chunks of Turkish land. So on May 19, 1919, a date that's now a national holiday in Turkey, Mustafa Kemal lands in Samsun, a city on the Black Sea coast.
And his official mission is what?
Officially, he's sent there by the Sultan to restore order and, crucially, to disarm the local Turkish militias that are resisting the Allies.
But he has a very different definition of restoring order.
Completely. He uses his official authority as Inspector General to do the exact opposite. He starts organizing a national resistance against the partition. He defies the Sultan. He defies the British. He starts gathering delegates, holding congresses in provincial towns like Erzurum and Sivas, basically laying the groundwork for a war of independence.
And the government in Istanbul is not happy about this.
Not at all. They recall him. He resigns from the army. They issue a warrant for his arrest. Eventually, when he refuses to back down, the Sultan's government sentences him to death in absentia.
Wow. Let's talk about high stakes. He's technically a mutineer with a death sentence hanging over his head.
But he's not just a mutineer anymore. He's building a parallel state. In April 1920, he establishes the Grand National Assembly, the GNA, in Ankara.
Which is deep in central Anatolia, far from the British gunboats in Istanbul.
As far as you can get. So now you have a diarchy, two competing governments. You have the old imperial government in occupied Istanbul, which represents the theocratic past and capitulation. And you have the new nationalist government in Ankara, representing resistance and the will of the Turkish people.
And this inevitably leads us into the second section of our deep dive, the War of Independence. Because he's not just fighting political battles anymore, he's fighting actual armies on multiple fronts.
It's an incredibly desperate situation. He's got limited resources, no real industrial base. He has to fight the Armenians in the east to secure that border. But the main existential threat is in the west, where the Greek army, supported and supplied by the Allies, is advancing deep into Anatolia, right toward Ankara.
They get pretty close, don't they?
Frighteningly close. The climax is the Battle of Sakarya in August and September of 1921. It was a brutal 3-week-long engagement, just miles from Ankara. You have to imagine the scene. The roar of the artillery is literally audible in the Parliament building while the delegates are debating.
And this is where he gets the title Ghazi, right?
Yes. The GNA forces, under Mustafa Kemal's personal command, managed to stop the Greek advance in its tracks. It was a bloody, hard-won victory. After that battle, the grateful Parliament promoted him to the rank of marshal and bestowed upon him the title Ghazi,
which means warrior or veteran, but it has a religious connotation, doesn't it? A holy warrior.
It does. Which is interesting, because here you have this committed secularist, but he's also a pragmatist. He needed to unite a very pious population of peasant soldiers. The title Ghazi carried immense weight with him. It framed the war not just as a defense of land, but as a defense of the faith against foreign Christian invaders. He knew what symbols to use.
So Sakarya stops the bleeding, and then comes the final push.
The Great Offensive in August 1922. It's a surprise attack that completely shatters the Greek lines. The Turkish forces drive the Greek army all the way back to the Aegean Sea, retaking the city of Izmir in September. That victory effectively ends the war on the ground.
And the Allies finally realize they can't enforce the partition. They have to deal with Ankara.
They have no choice. The government in Ankara is the only real power left.
So he wins the war, the foreign occupiers are gone. But now he turns his sights inward, on the very structure of the state. And this is where things get really, really radical.
Radical is the perfect word. He doesn't just want to restore the old system. He wants to tear it down completely. So in November 1922, the Grand National Assembly passes a law that abolishes the Sultanate.
That's huge. That's over 600 years of Ottoman rule. The House of Osman just ended with the stroke of a pen.
Ended. The Ottoman Empire is officially dead. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, flees into exile on a British warship.
Then, on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey is officially proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal becomes its first president.
A historic moment. But there's another shoe to drop. And this one in some ways seems even riskier, even more audacious than ending the Sultanate.
The Caliphate.
Yes, this is crucial to understand. The Ottoman Sultan wasn't just a king, he was also the Caliph, the spiritual leader of the entire Sunni Muslim world.
So it's like having a pope, basically, for Sunni Muslims.
In a sense, yes. It was a massive source of religious legitimacy and tradition that stretched back centuries. And even after the Sultanate was abolished, the Caliphate remained as a separate, purely religious office.
But not for long.
Not for long at all. Mustafa Kemal saw it as a relic, a political instrument of the past, and a potential rallying point for his conservative opposition. He famously said that the new republic could not be a land of sheiks, dervishes, and disciples. So in March 1924, just a few months after the republic was founded, he abolishes the Caliphate. The Caliph and his entire family are put on a train and expelled from the country.
That move must have sent shockwaves through the entire Muslim world.
It was an earthquake. But for Ataturk, it was a necessary amputation to save the patient.
And this really brings us to the Cultural Revolution, because once he clears the political deck of the Sultan and the Caliph, he starts this top-down campaign to change the daily life of the Turkish people. And when I say change, I mean he wants to pivot the entire civilization from east to west.
His goal was, in his words, complete independence. But for him, that also meant joining what he called the family of civilized nations, which in his mind was exclusively Western civilization. He believed the Ottoman Islamic past was the source of all the nation's problems, and it had to be severed.
He didn't want to modernize Islam. He wanted to modernize the state by removing Islam from the public sphere.
Exactly. And that brings us to maybe the most symbolic of all his reforms, the hat law of 1925. This one always fascinates people. Banning a hat. Why was a hat so important?
Right, it seems almost trivial, but it wasn't.
It was all about the visuals. The fez, that red, cylindrical, brimless hat with the tassel, was seen by Westerners as a symbol of the Orient. But within the empire, it was a symbol of religious and social order. Because it was brimless, a man could press his forehead to the ground during prayer without removing it. To Ataturk, it represented the old, backward religious mindset. It was the hat of a subject, not a modern citizen.
So he didn't just suggest people change hats, he made it illegal to wear a fez.
He did. He mandated Western-style hats, Panamas, fedoras, any hat with a brim. And he led by example. He went on a tour of the most conservative towns in Anatolia, like Kastamonu, and deliberately walked through the town square wearing a white Panama hat.
Just to make a point.
It was a direct challenge. He was basically saying, look at me. This is what a civilized, modern Turkish man looks like. Follow me.
Yeah.
It was a forced psychological shift. Change how people look to change how they think.
There was resistance, wasn't there?
Oh, there were riots. Some men were even hanged for refusing to give up the fez. It was not a gentle transition.
And then came an even bigger, more fundamental shift. The alphabet revolution in 1928.
This is it's mind-blowing in its ambition. The source notes that the literacy rate in the new republic was only about 10%. And a big reason for that was the script. Ottoman Turkish was written using a modified Arabic script.
And that was a problem.
A huge problem. Turkish is a Turkic language, full of vowels. It has 8 distinct vowel sounds. Arabic is a Semitic language whose script is based on consonants and has only 3 vowel markers. The fit was just terrible. It made learning to read incredibly difficult. It was an elite skill, reserved for scholars and bureaucrats.
So Ataturk's solution was just to scrap it entirely.
Scrap it. He decided to switch the entire nation to a new Latin-based alphabet, like the one used in English or French, which was much better suited to the sounds of Turkish. And he wanted to do it practically overnight.
And that's where we get that amazing anecdote about the timeline.
Right. He gathered a commission of linguists and experts and asked them how long the transition would take. They told him, if we work very hard, maybe 3 to 5 years to phase it in.
And Ataturk said,
He replied, we shall do it in 3 to 5 months. And he did.
how? How do you even do that?
He became the headmaster of the nation. He traveled the country with a blackboard and chalk, literally teaching the new letters himself in village squares and schoolyards. It was a massive nationwide mobilization. Newspapers, books, street signs, everything had to change.
The results were undeniable, though. Literacy rates skyrocketed.
They more than doubled between 1927 and 1940. It was a huge success in that regard. But there's a cultural cost to that, right? A massive one.
What was the cost?
By changing the alphabet so abruptly, he effectively cut the new generation off from the entire Ottoman written past. A child born in 1930 could not read the tombstone of their grandfather, who died in 1920. They couldn't read the old imperial archives, the classic poetry, the religious text. It was a hard reset of the national memory, intentionally so.
He also tackled the status of women with that same aggressive revolutionary speed.
This is one of the pillars of his legacy. He abolished polygamy. He did away with the Islamic courts, the Sharia courts, when it came to family law. In 1926, Turkey adopted almost wholesale the Swiss Civil Code.
Which meant what for women?
It meant that suddenly women had equal rights in divorce, in inheritance, and in child custody. This was a complete revolution from the patriarchal Ottoman system.
And he gave them political rights, too.
Yes, women gained the right to vote and to run for office in local elections in 1930 and in national elections in 1934. And the source makes a point of this. This was before France and before Switzerland.
That is just wild to think about. Turkish women were voting in national elections before French women were. And he used his own family as a model for this blue Turkish woman, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He had several adopted daughters. One of them, Sabiha Gökçen, famously became the world's first female fighter pilot. Think about the symbolism of that. In a country that, just a decade prior, was a traditional Islamic empire where women's public roles were heavily restricted, now the president's daughter is flying a combat airplane. It was an incredibly powerful message. The new Turkish woman can do anything.
But this all falls under the umbrella of secularism laïcité, as the French call it. It wasn't just about empowering women or changing alphabets. It was about removing religion from the public sphere entirely.
The separation of religion and state was absolute and non-negotiable for him. He closed the religious orders, the mystical Sufi lodges, the dervish convents. He called them places of primitivity and superstition.
He even had the call to prayer and the Quran translated from Arabic into Turkish.
Which was incredibly controversial.
Why so much?
Because for Orthodox Muslims, Arabic is the sacred language of Islam. It is the literal language of God's revelation. Translating the call to prayer, the ezan, into Turkish was seen by many as a deep sacrilege, an attack on the faith itself. But Ataturk's argument was a rationalist one. He said people should understand what they are chanting and praying. He wanted a rational religion, stripped of what he saw as superstition and, frankly, Arab cultural dominance.
Okay, so we've painted this picture of incredible, rapid, and often brutal modernization, but we need to look at the other side of the coin. This brings us to section 4, the shadow side. Because you don't overturn a society this fast without cracking some heads.
No, you absolutely don't. And this is where the dictator question comes in. The source material is very clear on this. While he championed the ideal of democracy in his speeches, he ruled through a strict one-party system. The Republican People's Party, the CHP, which he founded, was the only game in town for most of his rule.
There were some experiments with opposition parties, weren't there? They didn't last long.
They didn't. He allowed them, or even encouraged them, on a couple of occasions. There was the Progressive Republican Party in 1924 and the Liberal Republican Party in 1930. But every time an opposition party started up, it immediately became a rallying point for everyone who opposed the reforms. the religious conservatives, the monarchists, the Kurdish separatists, people who missed the Fez and the Caliph.
And when that happened,
Ataturk decided the country wasn't ready for multi-party democracy, and he shut them down. He saw them as threats to the revolution itself.
and it wasn't just about shutting down parties. Things got much darker. There was the 1926 assassination plot.
Yes, an assassination attempt against him was uncovered in the city of Izmir. This became the pretext for a massive purge of all his remaining political rivals. He set up these independence tribunals, which were basically kangaroo courts, and they tried and hanged dozens of opponents, including some of the former war heroes who had fought alongside him in the War of Independence, but who later disagreed with the speed and severity of his reforms.
So it consolidated his power completely.
It did. It sent a chilling message to everyone. There is no going back. Do not stand in my way.
We also have to talk about the treatment of minorities and this concept of Turkification, because the new republic was built on the idea of a homogeneous nation state.
It was. The slogan was Turkey for the Turks. And this had very serious consequences for the non-Turkish, non-Muslim populations.
The source mentions the Armenian genocide. Now, to be clear, Ataturk was not the architect of the 1915 genocide. He was at Gallipoli when it was happening. But what was the new republic's stance on it?
The source notes that his government essentially granted immunity to the perpetrators. The new state didn't look back or offer any kind of restitution or apology. The republic was, in many ways, built on the demographic engineering that had already removed the vast majority of Armenians and Greeks from Anatolia. It wanted a clean slate, and it wasn't interested in digging up the crimes of the past regime.
And then there's the Kurds. They were the largest remaining minority.
And the Kurds faced significant repression under the new centralized Turkish state. There were a number of major Kurdish rebellions, like the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925, which were framed as religious and reactionary uprisings and were crushed with overwhelming military force.
And there was a push for cultural assimilation, too.
A huge push. The government launched campaigns with slogans like, "Citizens speak Turkish," putting immense pressure on people to abandon non-Turkish languages in public. They even undertook a massive project of renaming geographical locations, changing thousands of Kurdish or Armenian village names to new Turkish ones.
The source specifically points to the Dersim massacre in 1937 and 38 as a particularly brutal example.
Yes, this is a military operation against a rebellion by Alevi Kurds in the Dersim region. The source notes that Ataturk was aware of the planning and personally gave operational orders. Thousands were killed, and much of the population was forcibly resettled to other parts of Turkey to dilute their demographic concentration. It was a brutal application of state power to enforce centralized control and a singular Turkish identity.
And even surnames became part of this project, didn't they? The surname law of 1934?
Yes. It's another one of those reforms that seems modern on the surface but had a darker assimilationist side. Every citizen had to take a fixed hereditary surname, like in the West. Before that, people mostly used patronymics, Ali, son of Ali. Mustafa Kemal himself was given the unique name Atatürk, father of the Turks, by the parliament.
But for minorities?
For minorities, they were often pressured or forced to take names that sounded Turkish. You were discouraged from having Armenian endings like Yan or Greek endings like Poulos. It was another tool for erasing difference and forging a single, uniform identity.
It's just such a stark contrast. On one hand, you have this progressive beacon of women's rights and mass literacy. On the other hand, you have forced assimilation and violent military suppression of dissent.
That is the fundamental complexity of Kemalism. It was a project of modernization, but it was absolutely not a project of liberalism or pluralism. It was about creating a unified, singular identity. He believed that for the Turkish state to survive in a hostile world, it had to be monolithic.
Let's shift gears a little bit to Section 5, foreign policy and his later years. Because for a guy who spent the first half of his life as a soldier fighting constant wars, his foreign policy slogan was surprisingly peaceful.
Peace at home, peace in the world. And he really stuck to it. This is what separates him from so many other dictators or strongmen of the 1930s. You think of Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. Ataturk did not try to expand Turkey's territory once the borders of the Republic were set. He wasn't an irredentist. He had no interest in trying to reconquer the old Ottoman lands in the Balkans or the Middle East.
He even made friends with former enemies.
He did, which was remarkable. He signed a treaty of friendship with Greece in 1930. Can you imagine? Just 8 years after his armies had driven the Greek army into the sea, he's hosting the Greek prime minister in Ankara. He established the Balkan Pact with Greece, Yugoslavia, and Romania. He understood that Turkey desperately needed a period of stability to focus on internal modernization.
And he pulled off a major diplomatic victory with the Turkish Straits.
The Montreux Convention in 1936. This was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Under the post-WWI treaty, the Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, had been demilitarized and internationalized. Ataturk correctly sensed that another major war was coming in Europe, and he skillfully used that fear to negotiate a new treaty that gave Turkey full military control over them. He regained full sovereignty over one of the most strategic waterways in the world without firing a single shot.
Now, what about the man himself during these later years, his personal life? The source material paints a picture of someone who lived, well, intensely.
He lived incredibly hard. He was known for being a very heavy drinker, particularly of raki, which is the Turkish anise-flavored national spirit. He smoked constantly. He worked late into the night, often until dawn. He was an intellectual insomniac, always reading history, language, philosophy, always debating with his inner circle.
And he had a very brief marriage, correct?
Yes, to a woman named Latif Uşaklıgil. She was a well-educated, modern, westernized woman, in many ways the very model of the new Turkish woman he was promoting. But the marriage was reportedly stormy and unhappy, and it lasted only 2 years. It seems he was far more married to his project, to the nation, than he could be to any individual. He was a very solitary figure at the top.
And there's that odd little detail about his name changing again. In 1935, he briefly changed it.
Briefly. This is a great deep cut for the history nerds. During the height of his Sun language theory reforms, where he was trying to prove that all languages derive from Turkish, he changed his name from Kemal to Kemal, spelled with a circumflex over the A. He claimed it was an ancient, pure Turkic word for fortress. But it didn't really catch on, and he quietly went back to Kemal after about a year. Just shows you how deeply obsessed he was with the language project. He was willing to rewrite his own name to fit the theory.
Sadly, that intense, hard-living lifestyle caught up with him.
It did. He was diagnosed with advanced cirrhosis of the liver. He spent his final months in the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, the opulent former palace of the sultans he had overthrown. He died on November 10th, 1938. He was only 57 years old.
And that brings us to his legacy, Section 6. Because he dies in 1938, but in a very real way, he never really left Turkey.
He left behind a country that was utterly unrecognizable from the one he was born into. In just 15 years as president, he transformed a medieval agrarian theocracy into a budding modern industrial state. The source notes that GDP per capita rose significantly. He initiated state-led industrialization, building factories for sugar, for cotton, even for aircraft. He laid the industrial foundation of modern Turkey.
But the cult of Ataturk that we talked about in the intro, it's interesting that it actually got stronger, more institutionalized after he died.
It did. It became fossilized into state ideology. In 1951, the Turkish government passed a law 5816, on crimes committed against Ataturk. It is literally a criminal offense in Turkey to this day to publicly insult his memory or to damage his statues or portraits.
So his image is protected by law. You don't see that in many democracies.
Almost none. And then there's that ritual on November 10th.
I find this absolutely fascinating.
It is one of the most surreal and powerful things you can witness. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, at exactly 9:05 a.m., the minute he died, air raid sirens wail across the entire country. And everything stops. Traffic stops on the Bosphorus Bridge in Istanbul. People get out of their cars and stand at attention. Ferries blow their horns. The whole country, 85 million people, pauses for a minute of silent tribute.
That is incredible. It shows a level of national devotion that is very hard for outsiders to comprehend.
It connects back to that name, Ataturk, father of the Turks. In Turkish culture, the father figure is paramount, and he is the ultimate father of the nation.
And his global perception is just as complex. Leaders of the decolonizing Third World, people like Gandhi in India, Bourguiba in Tunisia, they absolutely adored him. They saw him as the pioneer, the first leader from the East to stand up to the Western imperial powers and win.
Exactly. He proved that the West wasn't invincible. He provided a blueprint for creating a modern nation state out of the ashes of empire. But he also had admirers in very, very different corners of the world.
The source mentions Hitler.
Yes, and this is the chilling part of the legacy. Hitler openly admired him. He called Ataturk a star in the darkness. What Hitler saw was a fellow nationalist who had taken a defeated empire, purged it of what he saw as foreign elements, rejected an internationalist treaty, and built a strong, centralized, militarized state. The methods appealed to him.
That's a very uncomfortable endorsement.
It is. But we have to be very careful here. Ataturk was not a fascist. He rejected the expansionist racial purity ideologies of the Nazis and, in fact, kept Turkey neutral during most of World War II, preventing fascism from taking root there. But his methods of top-down authoritarian state-building certainly appealed to authoritarians everywhere. John F. Kennedy respected him, Winston Churchill respected him, and yes, the dictators respected him too.
So when we zoom all the way out, what's the final takeaway here?
I think the takeaway is the sheer magnitude of his impact. We're talking about a man who forced an entire nation to jump centuries forward in a single generation. He changed the clothes they wore, the letters they wrote, the laws they lived by, and the very way they related to God. No other 20th century leader, with the possible exception of Mao, changed the daily life of his people so completely and so rapidly.
But the central question remains, and the source alludes to this very strongly. He built the structures of a modern democracy, but he ruled as an autocrat to protect them.
And that is the final provocative thought here. Ataturk believed he had to be a dictator so that one day Turkey wouldn't need one. He believed the people weren't ready for the responsibilities of democracy, so he had to act as their tutor, to force them, to guide them into modernity. He called it a period of tutelage.
So the question for you, listening, is this. Can a true, sustainable democracy ever really be established from the top down by a single, powerful, authoritarian figure? Or does that benevolent dictator model inevitably leave deep fractures, like the intense polarization between secularists and religious conservatives we see in Turkey today that last for generations?
It's the difference between building a house and growing a tree, isn't it? He built the house very quickly, very strongly, with a clear blueprint. But did the democratic roots have enough time to take hold naturally in the soil? That is the question Turkey is still answering, almost a century later.
A fascinating and very heavy question to end on. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.
Thank you.